right, if folks want to filter in, we're going to get started with our next session. So welcome to track 1. We're doing some fundamentals around passkeys here in this track. So we've had a 101, we've talked about enterprise, we've talked about doing the internal sales process, what that looks like. We looked at some data. We've done a lot, and it's all been really great. What about regulated industries? What about folks that have to comply with regulations like PSD2? How should they be looking at passkeys? I'm really pleased to welcome Ralph Lindeman, who's the Vice President of Products at Knock Knock, here to talk about that. Ralph's not just the Vice President of Product at Knock Knock, but he's also our resident technical expert. He's the person I call if I have a question about FIDO. So please help me to welcome him. You got to leap onto the stage.
Yes. Okay, so good afternoon. Great to see everyone. And I thought 600 people, this is really exciting, just to tell, and especially because I remember the times 10 or 11 years back now, where we were 6 people and a bold idea in a room. And where this was all theory, what we are talking about now. And so I thought maybe we start with providing some context, right? So where, I don't repeat the 10 years that are behind us, right? But at least start from there and look into what do we think will happen going forward and why is this topic so relevant, especially at this stage. So the first thing we really want to, we achieved is the interoperable ecosystem, right? Which is, I think, a really great achievement. You see that Passkeys, or that at least single device credential at that point in time hit the market. We worked on sharing verifiable claims, right? And then the synced passkeys appeared, right? And that was really a game changer, and that all is state of the art, right? Last year, I used that slide last year at my presentation, at what happened since then. So that road continued, and I said, okay, and there are some things which will need to happen next, or I expect to happen next. The next thing was pluggable passkey providers. That was on the slide. Then we said, okay, we need more. We need security evidence for passkey providers. We need even more. We want transaction confirmation, right? All these things about non-repudiation that we need to talk about and think in a context which goes beyond just the session authentication, right? Where you want to approve a specific financial transaction, for example. Right? And going there further, right, we want security evidence for this passkey provider itself as well, not only for a potentially device-bound credential, right, and so forth, right, SPC, which works for hybrid cases like the security keys as well, and then extend the whole concept to not only transfer passkeys from one device to the other and share, but also to do the same with identity attributes, right? Like verifiable claims or whatever technology you might use. In the end, you might want to extend that, and you want an interoperable ecosystem for that in the same way we have FIDO. Now, back to, okay, where are we? What are we doing now? Right? So there is the 2023 aspect of that, where we really are at the forefront. So we have seen the passkey providers, the pluggable passkey providers announced with Android 14 and becoming to life with iOS 17. So we know this is true already. And so there are some upcoming topics which I marked blue here. And these are the ones which I think are the relevant pieces to have next. And why are they relevant? This is what this talk is about, and why the entire topic even came up, which is because we have synced passkeys. So let's dive into the regulatory requirements and how we think about security in the regulatory environment, right, to really make it easy to understand and clearly visible. And so this is nothing new. I guess everyone has seen that. We typically think about security in the terms of there's a knowledge factor, there's a possession factor, there's an inherence factor. And if you ask people about examples, they will tell you, yep, knowledge factor is a password. The possession factor is an OTP token, right, or a phone, right, and the inherence factor could be a biometric like a fingerprint or facial recognition system. Now, this is all great, and this is reflected in regulatory requirements. If you look into PSD2, which is a European one, if you look into NIST SP 863, right, it's always talking about these. There needs to be a possession factor, and there needs to be something distinct from that, different from that, right? It needs to be a knowledge factor potentially, or a combination of inherence. And however you combine that, right, the regulatory environment is pretty clear on there needs to be a combination of and independent factors. Right? You can go deeper into that, right? That what kind of memorized, what a secret means, right? The user needs to memorize that secret and know that secret. And in PSD2, it's even the case that only the user should memorize it, which I think is a good point, right? So it's not about your primary account number of your credit card or your first pet's name. In the end, it's something which should be secret, right? Like a password in the best case, at least. PSD3, at least the draft goes a little beyond that, and they say the independence is a relevant piece, right? Whether you classify this way or that way is not that relevant, which I think is an interesting observation there. But, right, so what is the purpose? I tell that in practice, if you read the studies, in 62% of the cases, the password is written down. And it's a lookup factor, right? So it's really not a secret you memorize anymore in the majority of the cases, which I think is somewhat telling. And only in 30% of the cases, people said the password is something they remember and they do not write down anywhere. So, and by the way, I count on my accounts, I think I have well above 500 accounts differently, and there's no way for me to remember all 500 different passwords, right? So I can't even know my passwords, which clearly makes it a non-knowledge factor, right? It's not known. It's written down somewhere, somehow. And the good thing is, it typically increases the security. It doesn't reduce the security, right? Even though we are thinking from the perspective of the regulatory regime as being the knowledge factor only, right? This is the security requirement. In practice, the world is different, right? It's not a in a knowledge factor, but that doesn't reduce the security of it. That somehow makes it better because our brains don't scale to 500 different secrets we have to remember. So interesting studies there and takeaways. So for me, and this is a more abstract way to look at that, there are things, if you look about regulatory regimes, there are things which are clearly in the horizon, in scope of the regulation, that things people have thought about. Password length, password complexity, that's all the things we looked into and the regulations think about and talk about, and there is a invisible zone, right? Some things, some space which is just not approached by the regulation, not addressed at all, right? It's just invisible, and the example could be password managers, right? It's not in scope. Regulations don't talk about password managers, they talk about knowledge factors, and everyone thinks this is a password. And they don't talk about cloned OTP devices, typically, right? It's a possession factor you have, and you somehow assume that is a possession factor, and you don't have visibility into that. So from that perspective, there's different myths about security and authentication. And the first one for me is a password is a reliable knowledge factor. And that's not really true, right? We learned we cannot rely on a password being a knowledge factor and independent from a possession factor. In practice, at least, it's different. In practice, the majority of the cases, this is already a possession factor. And if I combine that with yet another possession factor, I'm not in line with how the regulations are written. Interesting observation. Number two, also very interesting, possession factors can be cloned today, right? And that became obvious to me when Google announced now you can sync your Google Authenticator seed, which is great from a usability perspective, but from a regulatory and possession factor perspective, it just removed it, right? What is that OTP now? It's nothing, right? It's maybe some possession factor, maybe not. So at least it's telling that device migration is already outsourced to third parties. And if you think this is only a Google thing or an Authenticator app thing, it's not, right? SMS, OTP, it's a phone number. And who manages the SIM cards and the phone numbers and the relation between the SIM card and the phone number? That's the MNO. Right? So already security has been, or my device management has been outsourced to third parties without direct contractual agreements between relying parties and that third party. Interesting observation. Okay, what does it mean for passkeys in regulated markets? We need to have a complete look into passkeys. And the complete look includes the registration and the authentication. And the registration is typically the step you do after having ID-proofed the user through whatever method it might be. It could be legacy authentication, it could be docauth, what we heard earlier today, right, or some other method as well. And before you can create a FIDO credential, you need to do that kind of ID proofing or registration step with whatever kind of ID proofing you want to do. Now, if users have multiple devices, that means you have to do that step multiple times, right? 3 devices means 3 times registration of that device-bound credential and 3 times, and then you can authenticate. And then to the next device, you do the registration with the legacy authentication or ID proofing, and then you do the authentication, and then the third one, right? And this is typically what, has some kind of impact on the usability. And to go back, right, when I spoke many times about FIDO, that was a question we heard very often. What about the recovery case or multi-device case? How usable, how practical is that? What would you do in that case, right? I think now Passkeys are a solution for that because they changed that game, right? They somehow say you register once and then you can use a passkey on all the devices you have. There's a bootstrapping process, but that is tied to the passkey provider and not to the relying party. So if I have 10 different bank accounts on my phone, meaning 10 different banking apps, or relying party apps in general, I should say, right? In that case, I have to do the bootstrapping, the registration once on one device, right? And I can use all the 10 different apps on the other devices as well in an instant, right? Just because a passkey provider takes care of that and makes sure that I have an ability to share and access the credentials on that other device. So technically it means adding new devices is handled by the passkey provider as opposed to the relying party. And the advantage is the passkey provider is a single entity on a device where relying parties are multiple entities. And so for the user, you can improve the usability by just reducing it down to a single action for device migration or multi-device bootstrapping, and then all the credentials are available. And what does that mean? Reduce complexity for the relying party, only a single action for the user per device, but that's where the challenges come from, right? So the current regulatory requirements are not written with those things in mind. So they expect and clearly state that relying parties, the regulated entities, are responsible for the device handling. So the bank, right, for example, must know that this is a real user and not the friend which might have received that passkey through whatever mechanism, sharing mechanism, similarly to how I could share a password today, right? It's just not, it's part of the terms and conditions that I may not do that. It was kind of hidden behind the horizon. Now it becomes visible. This is the main difference, right? Now the spec makes it very obvious that you could potentially share a passkey with a friend through a method, and that the passkey provider handles that device handling. And so this becomes relevant, visible in scope for the regulation. Now we have to deal with that situation. We can't just say, put it in the terms and conditions that users shouldn't do that, right? We can't do that anymore. And by the way, PSD3 already states that that might be possible, but banks would need a right to audit the passkey provider, right? Which I think fits well with the concept of pluggable passkey providers. You could have regional ones which fulfill all the regulatory requirements, have mutual contracts with the banking world there, right? And then that would work, would be regulatory compliant. That's great. So what would we technically do as a relying party to meet those requirements with passkeys? The first thing is, what do I do if I detect a new device to be used? Right? Typically, I would say, okay, hi Sarah, right? I see you the first time on that new device. Now I have to verify it's really you. It's not one of your friends. It's not an attacker, right? To just make sure it's really you on that device. Please verify that with some existing method, right? It could be I sent you an OTP, or I asked you to tap that device to the old device to the new device. You scan the QR code, receive a push notification, do ID proofing, right? Use FIDO CTAP hybrid on that old device somehow, right? Different methods, how relying parties implemented their task, but they can have control over that, right? And with that, I think there are two fundamentally different approaches to do that device management. The first is insource the device management back to the relying party. Technically, right, you are the relying party, you maintain a kind of a device ID. Per device, whenever you see and know the device, you're saying, okay, I know you, I can trust that device already. If you see a new device ID, you say, hi Sarah, right, this is a new device, first time I see you on this one, now I give you a new device ID, but first I have to verify it's really you, let me do that. Works on all platforms, great, but it's not the same level of security because it's not a cryptographic secret which is baked into a trusted execution environment, for example. But that could be the second approach, right? With all the supplemental keys which are discussed in the web authentication working group, you as a relying party could ask the device to give you a supplemental key with provider scope, for example, right? Or a device public key, and then say, okay, this is a key which is specific for that device, right? And now I can trust that device. And if it's a new key which I don't remember or recognize, in that case, I can say, oops, now Sarah, right, it's the first time I see you on this new device. I have to do something special, and that is the one I want to do, so please verify it's really you. So from that perspective, right, attestation is important to know the security level of that, right, that I really can trust that key, that it makes a difference to the device ID. But with that concept, it's insourced again, it's under control of the relying party, so you just combine synced passkeys with device-bound credentials or keys on that device. That works on certain set of platforms, at least in all native apps you can do. And so you are regulatory compliant from that perspective. Now you could ask, what is the benefit? Is it a full benefit? I think it works at least as we are used to doing that today, right? Every relying party manages the device migration separately. Now the second approach is different, right? The second approach is really, maybe we can outsource the device management to a passkey provider, but to a known one and to one that I specifically, as a bank, specifically would trust in that specific region. And again, back to the supplemental keys, right? There is a way to not only get a device-bound credential, but also get a provider scope credential. If you would get that credential, you get the attestation for that, so you know. Identifying attestation, by the way, it needs to be, so I know exactly what kind of passkey provider it is. That is the one I have a contract with, so I have all the audit rights to fulfill the regulatory requirements. In that case, I can just say, oops, give me that key, and if I see that key, I trust, right, because it's contractually agreed upon that this key tells me that this is the right user. The passkey provider somehow it's an outsourcing provider to me. They manage the device migration and device recovery and all this kind of complexity, and they might do that for multiple relying parties in my region, so they provide the additional benefit to the user to do that new device bootstrapping only a single time and not once per relying party. And this just requires all the things we had in blue on that first slide, if you remember, right? We need passkey providers, we need some kind of attestation for the passkey provider itself, right? And we need the supplemental keys in some way, right? Keys which are which live in a defined scope, right? Which cannot freely be exported to that. So attestation again is important to know the security level, and also in this case relevant to know whether I have a contract with that specific relying passkey provider or not, right? So in summary, passkeys give you better security than passwords already today, even though it's kind of surprising sometimes that the traditional way of thinking security with our three possession, knowledge, and inherence factors falls apart a little. At least it becomes more obvious, right? It fell apart some years ago already, but now we realize it really fell apart. And so we have to deal with that. Passkeys make it easier to use multiple devices for users. So it's great for the users. It can be great for relying parties, even the regulated relying parties, if they get some of the new characteristics we are talking about, or if they manage it themselves, right? Two different approaches we have seen there. So sync passkeys can be augmented, right, to implement strong device binding, which is required for regulated entities. So no need to wait. you can deploy that as so many others have done that already. Thank you.
Ralph, thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Great talk, Ralph. In the scenario about the strong device binding blessing with passkeys, are you talking about it in an aspirational sense? Since in iOS right now, you don't get the device attestation. So if you sync it passkeys, there's no way for me as a bank or relying party to know which device was used to attestate the strong authentication.
Yes, so there's some truth to that, right? Some is reality today, right? So the first thing I showed, this one, right? Device management by relying, that is reality today. Right? That's not aspirational. You can do those things today because you can assign a device ID on any device, any platform, even browsers on iOS devices. And in all native apps, you can have a device-bound key, right? It might not be a passkey in the traditional sense, right? There are different technologies, FIDO technologies you can use for that, which is great. So you have all what you need to have a strong way to manage the device, use yourself as a relying party. The aspirational part is number 2, right? This one is aspirational, right? This is a reason why in web authentication we are discussing the provider scoped keys and the attestation and all these things to say, okay, here's the story behind it, we can make it even better. Right, the first thing already improves security and convenience for the user. The second one goes even further, right, and improves it even more. Okay,
A question over here.
Sorry, a follow-up to what you mentioned, right? When you say the first one is implemented, what do you mean? Because device-bound keys is not supported in iOS, and even Google has it as in a beta version, right? Like they did not roll out DPKs fully, right? Like DPKs is not supported today, from what I understand.
Yes, so more specifically, there's a different protocol type, FIDO UAF, which from the beginning was focused on device-bound credentials for passwordless authentication, and you can still use that, right? Nothing wrong with that. There are silent authenticators which don't even talk to the user and force the user to take any action. So you can say, I combine a syncable passkey, which I have and also works in a browser, combine that with a silent authenticator in my native app. And so in the native app, you have the device-bound credential that we've spoken on iOS today, on Android today, right? All the things you need to make that really a regulatory compliant solution for banks in all regulated environments today.
Do you mind using the mic just for the...
In that case, device management would be...
on the relying party, right?
Yes,
okay.
Correct. The second one, the aspirational one, that is aspirational. We will get to that, hopefully, but that's under discussion for exactly that reason. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go here, and then I'm going to go here.
Sorry, one quick question. Maybe I didn't understand it, but in the second aspirational one, wouldn't that break the benefit ostensibly that Passkeys is trying to bring to the consumer, because this now requires consumer to sign up with different passkey providers dictated by the RP?
So at least it has an impact there. But for me, think about that, right? There's a region, and users are already kind of annoyed by migrating different banking apps to a new device, right? At least when I did that, it was a painful experience, right? For all the different banks with all the different procedures they have. So I, as a user, would be happy to sign up with one passkey provider in my region, which solves my problem, right? I'm from Germany, right? Would be a very European problem. But if they would be certified under European law to do all the things for the banks which I care about, right, I would be happy. And I'm quite sure the solution for US people would be different. But with the concept of pluggable passkey providers, we have the ability to have that, right? So passkey providers could step up. And there might be another user which says, I'm not doing banking on my smartphone at all, right? Which is okay. And they kind of use the default passkey provider which comes with a platform, right, without installing anything else. So I think that gives us the flexibility, right, to have the different solutions play with that, Right? It's a great concept. The pluggable passkey providers is really a great concept to have standardized APIs on the platform level, but geographically specific functionality underneath, right? Which I think is really great to have.
Okay, one more.
Regarding PSD2, do you know how European regulators, such as the CSSF, see passkeys in terms of, is it 2 factors or is it a single factor? So do I still need a second factor SMS OTP in addition to passkey, or could I consider it to be, let's say, knowledge-based if it's their PIN code and possession-based?
So there is no official response to that yet. Mm-hmm. I'm pretty sure that with that premise, right, that passkey provider and the provider scoped keys and the bilateral contractual agreement between the bank and the provider, that it would be seen very similar to the EU ID wallet, which the regulators already explicitly stated that is allowed and would be seen as 2-factor. So I'm quite sure we will get there.
Again.
Thank you.
So we just have a few minutes for transitioning to our next session, so we should get started in about 5 minutes.